Ethiopia is set to welcome a young and outspoken prime minister, an appointment that some hope will calm months of anti-government protests. 42-year-old Abiy Ahmed is from the Oromo ethnic group and is believed to have a huge amount of support among the Oromo youth, many of whom have been active in anti-government protests. Ethiopia began sliding into crisis in late 2015 when protests began among the Oromo's and the Amaras, who feel they are marginalized by the government. Both say the minority Tigray ethnic group has too much influence in the country. The protests led to a heavy crackdown. Hundreds of people were killed and tens of thousands were arrested. A 10-month state of emergency was imposed in October 2016. The Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, struggled to contain the unrest and in a shock move announced his resignation last month. He said that was to make way for reforms. Well, let's go live to Washington, D.C. now, where we can speak to Mohammed Ademo. He's the founder and editor of OPride.com, a news website about Oromo and Ethiopia. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. So Abiy Ahmed, the new leader of Ethiopia, do you think he's the right man for the job?
I think given the alternatives that the people of Ethiopia were given, he is certainly the one that is more qualified, one that has a semblance of legitimacy, a popular support of some sort, and clearly had a landslide victory within the ruling coalition that elected for him. So I think he is better positioned to be the prime minister. But again, I think a lot of it will depend on what he does and how he lay the ground out from here on forward.
And what do you think his main challenges will be? Because obviously Ethiopia is now coming, well, I mean, certainly perhaps coming out of a period of instability. So do you think that he will be able to calm the waters at least for a while?
I think in the short term, given that he has a popular support in Oromia, the epicenter of the anti-government protest over the last 4 years, in the short term, he has an opportunity to stabilize the situation. He also has a cross-cutting support across the Amhara region, the second largest in the country. In that sense, I think he is qualified. But again, it comes down to a question of whether or not the establishment, the security and the military interests who want to maintain the status quo will give him the full powers of the office of the prime minister to implement his own agenda, to make changes to the ruling structure of the party, putting a new cabinet, and really inviting the opposition and chart a better way forward for the country. So I think he will face challenges. These are deeply entrenched interests, and the party has been in power since 1991. He is relatively an outsider in a sense that his message is one of reform and one that is not highly popular with the powerful interests in the ruling coalition. So he faces challenges, but I think there is a lot of hope here, just on the virtue of the fact that he's the first Oromo prime minister. There is so much goodwill.
I mean, obviously, the protests, as you mentioned, started within the Oromo community. And mainly they started about land rights and then branched out into things, for example, like greater political representation. I mean, certainly having an Oromo a leader is hugely symbolic. But do you think that it will go past that? I mean, you hinted that obviously that you weren't sure that effectively that he was going to be allowed to make the changes that the people protesting had wanted to be made.
This is indeed a historic opportunity for the incoming prime minister. Not only is he the first prime minister from this ruling party, but in Ethiopia's long history, he is the only self-identifying Oromo to be the head of the state. So it's hugely symbolic. But ultimately, I think he comes from Oromia, which fills the highest number of members of parliament to the national parliament. He now has the office of the prime minister. So I think it's a question of using that advantage and the popular support from the streets to implement, to make changes right away. And he can start doing that next week or in the coming days when he takes over, by repealing the state of emergency, by announcing reforms, legal and political reforms that could really inspire confidence in the public, because the people are giving him the benefit of the doubt, but they don't really trust the party. The party has made so many promises and broke a lot of those promises over the last quarter of a century. So I think he has a unique historic opportunity. Would they allow him to do this? Would he be bold enough to take on this interest? Would he be able to take the reforms that he put in place in Oromia to the national office? I think those are the questions that needs to be answered. He can answer that by laying out a clear vision in his acceptance speech.
Well, we'll be following this story closely on Al Jazeera, so it'll be very interesting to see how his first weeks and months as leader pan out. For the moment, Mohammed Ademo, founder and editor of OPride.com. Sir, thank you for sharing your views with us.